what is probate? A lot of our listeners may have not even heard of that word. Can you define that for us?
Yeah. So when somebody passes, probate is the process that states use to transfer title from the deceased to whoever the heirs are. And so sometimes that process is done automatically. Sometimes that process requires certain procedures, and sometimes requires a whole drawn-out legal procedure. So kind of the nature of probate is just a transfer of assets from somebody who's deceased to the heirs who receive it. In real estate, sometimes the deeds we have automatically transfer. So husband and wife buy a property together. They take title as husband and wife. As community property or as joint tenants, husband passes, it goes to wife. Or if wife passes, it goes to husband automatically. Or two people buy a property, joint tenants, automatically goes from one to the other. But other types of title don't. Tenants in common, two people buy a property together, but they're tenants in common. If one passes, the value of that property, that estate, goes to that person's heirs, whoever they may be. Could be their kids, could be their spouse, could be whoever they designate. If you have a will, and this is the number one misconception is people think, well, I have a will, I don't need to go to probate. Let me back up a little bit. So if you don't have a plan for how things transfer when you pass, the state has one for you. And it looks a lot like the Department of Motor Vehicles. It's just not as consumer friendly as the DMV. So, and I say that as a bit of a joke, but if you don't have a plan, the state of California, for example, has a process with lots of fees and attorneys and costs and drawn out time to make sure they get their tax money and make sure creditors get paid, and maybe if there's some crumbs left over, they'll go to your heirs. Popular misconception is you avoid probate with a will. That's absolutely not true in California and in most states. In most states, if you have a will, the will is probated in court. The court authenticates the will and effectuates the will's direction, but that is done through probate. You can avoid probate, however, in most cases with a proper estate plan, usually including a living trust. So I really encourage people who own real estate at a minimum to set up a proper estate plan, and usually at a minimum that includes a living trust, and either find if you have a complicated matter, find a proper attorney. If you're single or just maybe husband and wife, it's a simpler trust. You can go online, trustandwill.com is a cheap way to do that. So probate is the transfer of assets from deceased people to their heirs.
Okay, and it's unfortunate so many people lack plans.
Yes.
So you probably have a lot of homes in probate.
Well, failing to plan is planning to fail. And there are lots of probates every month in LA County. There's over 500 that are filed. Now, there are cases where you can plan and there's still litigation, right? You can have the world's best trust, but sometimes just siblings are going to fight and they'll hire attorneys. And when there's a lot of money, there's almost always some sort of a fight. But you can limit it, and you can probably improve the odds tremendously by having a plan. And so I definitely encourage people. A lot of my lead generation activity is encouraging people who have property and they own it in their name to get a proper plan set up and transfer the property. That's the other part is people set up plans, but then they don't finalize it by taking the property and putting it into the trust. And so that's like buying a safe, and you come home with a fancy safe and you polish it and make it clean, and you put it in your closet, but you don't put your gold and your cash and your valuables in the safe. Well, then the safe doesn't do any good. So with a trust, you have to deed your assets into the trust for the trust to be effective.
Correct. Now, from the perspective of a real estate investor, why would it be so appealing as a niche for someone? What are the advantages of probate for an investor?
So I think that I would approach it two ways. I would approach it as the incidental occurrence, and I would approach it as the full-time real estate investor. So if you're a regular real estate investor, I think that oftentimes people bring up the term probate and it scares people away, and that's a mistake. I think that people oftentimes think that the easiest path is the best. It's probably not. Normally it's if you can work through the problems, that's where the extra yield is, that's where the extra benefit is. And so I'd say that if you come across an investment, but there's probate involved, find somebody who can help you understand what the risks are and deal with them appropriately, or what work has to be done to clear it. Because I have wholesalers, investors who bring me property. This is what I do. And they'll say, hey, we found this property. We want to do this deal. Everybody's on board. But it turns out that the guy we're talking to only owns half of it. You know, his grandfather passed away and that was never probated. It needs to be done. And an attorney might cost on $1 million property $23,000 plus fees. Average probate could take a year to sell the property. In fact, an average in LA is probably 2 years. So I'm an expert in this area. Sometimes I can save you, and the legal fees can be $1,700 instead. And instead of sending it to just any probate, I can send it to an expert who can clear the title and be ready for sale maybe in 45 or 60 days. So that's the incidental investor. If you come across a property and there's a title problem that involves somebody who died and there's some sort of cloud on the title, that's where I can help, or you can find somebody as a probate expert to help you to clear out what that is. For a regular full-time investor, I think you have to pick a niche to lead generate in. I think every great real estate investor I ever met who's a full-time investor, and I'm not talking about somebody who has a business and happens to invest in real estate like me, but they're people who are full-time real estate investors. That's their business. They
Correct.
flip properties, or they do BRRRRs, or they do storage properties. They look at 100 deals and they buy one a month or something like that. So you have to have a process to generate leads. What's it going to be? And so one could be calling on probate filings to see if those are properties that you can represent, either to make purchases on as a cash offer, or in my case, to list.
What other ways can we get probate leads?
Well, it depends where you are. So in LA County, for example, because we have, we're the largest probate court in America, some properties need court approval, and sometimes they're sold cheaper than the market, and an investor can offer to pay a little bit more than the prior buyer and get the property. So oftentimes in the MLS, you'll look at property for sale, and it looks like a good price, but you're going to be bid up. Here's a case where you know what the sales price is, unless somebody else comes in and overbids, or somebody else wants to auction. It's a little less competition. So I say buying properties that need court confirmation are another opportunity that some investors have done well with over the years.
So seems like probate has less competition than finding a deal, another type of deal, because of the lengthy process involved. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think
advantages?
Yeah, I say that there's certain buyers or agents who, when they see it's a probate, just avoid it. And so there's a little less competition, and I think that you want to look for that, number one. Number two, most probate properties, somebody died, and the person who is inheriting it doesn't want to live there, right? They already lived someplace before the person died. So for example, my aunt just passed away. She lives in Florida. I live in California. I'd like to move to Florida, but that's a different story. But I'm not moving to Florida. I'm married. My wife doesn't want to move there yet. So absent a divorce, I'm not moving to Florida. So I don't inherit her property. She has daughters. But if I did inherit the property, I'd have to sell it. So part of the reason why people market to probates is because, for the most part, they're motivated to sell the property. Usually there's a combination of they're not living in it, so they don't want to live there, or geographically it's not desirable, or the condition of the property. Generally, as people age, they stop maintaining it, it starts to get run down, and so they just soon sell it and take the cash and do something else with it. So one reason why it's attractive to investors is, for the most part, those properties are being sold. And I find there is investors who maybe hit several niches: distressed properties, probate properties, vacant properties, out-of-state owners. It's one of those niches where you can combine it in that package. Some investors look for a combination, like they look for probate where the petitioner is also out of state, or distressed and probate.
Correct.
And so I know investors who are full-time who look for those 2 or 3 layers of data, and that's what they're attacking.
Now, say we're going to focus on probate and we go to the court and we win a bid. Can you kind of walk us through a simple process of what happens after they get the bid? Are the courts involved? Is there a real estate agent involved? How does that work?
So it varies by every state. In California, technically, the property is not bought through the MLS. It's bought from the court. You're buying it through the court, even though it might be listed by an agent, and I might be an agent. Our contract is the court document. And so in California, what happens is a buyer agrees to buy a property. And just like a normal deal, they waive their contingencies and they have a deposit at risk. And they go to the court and say, hey, we're willing to buy this property for this price. Let's say $500,000. Certain probate properties require court approval. You can find those properties offer to overbid that price by 5% plus $500. So for example, if somebody's buying a property for $500,000, you can offer $525,000, $500,000. Certain conditions apply. But if you do and they don't raise the price, then you just bought it. And the process in California is that you have 10 days to close from the date of receipt of an original order signed by the judge. You say, what's the big deal there? In some counties, the judge will sign the order the day of the sale. They'll literally pull up the form, the judge will hand it back and sign it. In LA County, they don't do it that way. You have to create the order form, send it to the judge. Oftentimes it's done incorrectly because they're very particular on those forms. And so in my experience, it might be 30 or 45 days before the judge signs it. So I tell my investors, you probably have 30 days to close the deal. But be ready to close it quickly as 10. So it just depends on the particular situation. Who the attorney is.
I'm sorry?
Who the attorney is, for example, who the judge is. So those are things where, again, I know the court, and I urge agents who want to do this or investors is try to learn on the inside who the players are so that you know, is the seller anxious to close? If you overbid the property, they're going to force you to close in 10 days, or are they okay waiting 30 days if you need financing, things like that.